So, as you already learned a little bit, my name is Pete Behrens, and I want to share just a couple of things maybe about me that might help understand a little bit about who I am. One is I tend to be kind of curious by nature, which led me into engineering. And some ask, how do you get from being an engineer into being what I would call today probably a leadership trainer and coach? Uh, yeah, I have a lot of leadership kind of experience myself in terms of different types of, engineering type of leadership. But I would actually argue what leaders do is engineering. Let me just explain that for a second. So if you think about what the goal of engineering is, it's to optimize a people or optimize some kind of system like an elevator bank or a parking lot or computer system. For me, it was I focused mostly on computer technology, so it was optimizing database and access systems, things like that. Leadership is all about optimizing people systems. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's a bit of an engineering problem. And I actually find it to be quite fascinating to think about how we get the fewest amount of people to produce the most amount of value to customers. And so that's really when you start thinking about leadership, and the goal of leadership is pretty fascinating. And that's what I find to be fascinating, is solving some of these people type problems. And so, I encourage you to think about that in your own space here. How do you look at leadership, and what does leadership mean to you? Now, I represent a couple of entities here. Entity number one is what we call the Agile Leadership Journey, and I'll share a little bit more about this as we go through here. Now, the purpose of the Agile Leadership Journey is to essentially build an ecosystem to help leaders better understand how they impact Agile through their own improvements as well as their organizations. And so we are a community of educators and coaches, but we're also building a leadership community for those leaders that are doing that. If you want to know more a little bit about the Agile Leadership Journey, I put a link in your chat. Welcome, Philippa. Thanks for joining and going on video. Make it a little bit more interactive. I get a visual audience. Thanks for being on video. It's always nice to know I'm not alone here. And so let's start with this question. Why should we even change as leaders? And yeah, obviously, we got the main things that it's healthy, right, to change as an individual, right, personal development. But what I want to connect us to is organizational transformation won't happen without leadership transformation. And so if we want a more adaptive organization, we're going to require more adaptive leaders. When we think about it, right, all organizations are human systems. And so the only way to get an organization that's more agile is to have people in that organization that are more agile. So now the question is, okay, what is an adaptive leader? Oops, wrong direction. An adaptive leader is not one who knows Agile. We talked about this a little bit in the pre-discussion, right? It's not enough just to say, oh, I know Scrum, right? What we want to think about is an adaptive leader is one who has agility. But what does that mean? When we think about agility in leader, we think about, okay, the ability to move, kind of like a dog saying, okay, I can chase a squirrel, right? We often talk about dogs as having agility. But there's another side of agility that I find to be more valuable, and that is what we call thinking agility, an adaptive mind. So what does that mean? So what we think about here is creativity is agility of the mind. And so adaptive movement really isn't that useful without adaptive thought. And adaptive leaders are more creative, creating better choices, better decisions, especially in complexity and uncertainty. So what I want you to understand is, number one, if we want organizational change, we need leadership change. And number two, Agile leadership isn't just teaching Agile to leaders. There is a fundamental underlying, we can teach agility in leadership. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, can I become a more adaptive leader myself? And then can I, catalyze a system to do that? So pause point here. And I encourage you to be bold. I know we've been on Zoom meetings a lot, and whether it's hop in or Zoom or just on computers, I encourage you to journal. on this. And so I'm going to try to journal a little bit with you and actually put in notes in our comments. But I encourage you also to comment as you're doing it, as well as if you've got a notepad or something, go ahead and write these 5 words down. Pause here. We're going to be talking about purpose, perspective, presence and power, and practice. And I want to share some stories and understand. I'm going to create pause points here on each one of these so we can chat about them and talk a little bit about how this might help in your leadership practice or in leaders you're seeing work through this. Welcome, Maria. Thanks for joining our visual side of this session. Appreciate that. So, and if you have questions along the way, feel free to chat, interrupt me, or throw it in the in the chat here. So I'm seeing quite a few people. Thanks for joining us. So let's start with purpose. So the definition of purpose, and by the way, I love going to the root definition because I think we lose track sometimes of what things mean. So the real basic definition of purpose is just the reason we do something, right? This is the why. But hey, welcome, Antonio. Now you have your sound. That's good. The more valuable word to me behind purpose is resolve or determination. Now, this to me is somebody has. Hey, Antonio, can we mute? Oh, I can mute you. Okay, good. I muted you, Antonio. You were loud. So I love the concept of resolve. Now, if you're not native English, resolve is this: I have a desire. I have this more than just a reason. I have actual directional resolution to do something, right? That determination to do something. And so when I'm thinking about purpose, it's more than just a pause. It's more than just a why. So I want you to close your eyes. I'll do the same. And I want you to take 2 deep breaths. Okay. If nothing else, hopefully we recentered you. Why did we do that? Why are you here today? What is your purpose in this moment right now? For me, the reason I do this isn't just to promote. The reason I do this is I actually find that I learn more by teaching sometimes than I do by doing, because it helps me learn something more deeply. Kind of like, what is purpose? And so what I want you to think about is, what is your purpose? Why are you here? And what is it that's driving you in this moment? Because when we think about humans, right, we often maybe have a large purpose, but do we have small purpose? So question for you: how many decisions do you make each day? Well, studies show that we make over 10,000 decisions a day. I'm going to take a decision to drink my coffee. I'm going to make a decision to speak up in this meeting. I'm going to make a decision to ask a question, or do I say a statement? Do I stay quiet? Do I talk now or do I talk later? Do I sit up when I speak? Do I speak loudly? Do I speak softly? Every one of these is a decision. Now, research says that could go up to like 30,000 a day. It's hard to tell in a brain what's a decision, what's not, but there's a lot. But when we ask people, they say we only make about 70 decisions a day. When you ask them, how many decisions did you make today? About 70 is the average. So what this is indicating is just that difference between subconscious and conscious. What do I know I'm doing versus what I think I'm doing, or what's running in autopilot? So the concept here is, without purpose or resolve, most of what we do is habitual or accidental. Okay. So without clarity in agility and thought, action is simply wasted movement. So when we think about agile, and relate this to agile teams, You got some agile teams that says, yeah, we're agile. We're, going here. It's like that dog, squirrel, 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 squirrel. Agile movement isn't very useful on its own. Agility in thought combined with agile movement is quite powerful. So in fact, adaptive leaders aren't without, that's kind of a double negative, not without clarity of purpose. What it means is here, it's the clarity of purpose agile leaders have that enable agility. Let me say that again. It's the clarity of purpose that enables agility. If you don't know where you're going, agility is useless. I could turn left, I could turn right, I could go straight. Doesn't matter. I don't know where I'm going. It's the clarity of purpose that gives us that meaningful direction of execution. So one of the ways I want you to think about this is every moment, every day, every week, every meeting, we can create purpose. And as I'm thinking about adaptiveness as a leader, more effective adaptive leaders create purpose in these micro moments, create more intense self-awareness, understanding, connection in these small moments. And this, in a sense, starts to create what we call is the eye of the storm. Okay, what does that mean? So we use this concept in a tornado. If you've got the little eye, the eye is where everything's calm. And this kind of grounds the leader. So clarity grounds the leader so that when everything else is in turmoil, it's the purpose that creates the centering effect. Now, another kind of a play on words, I like to play with words a little bit, that we think about the eye of the storm, might feel a little selfish using the word I, me, I could be the eye of the storm. In an adaptive system, things are crazy. Things are changing. People are adapting, pivoting. If I have clarity of purpose, I get grounded, turmoil around me, and I can start to sense that crazy around me, and I can start to create a little bit more clarity, calmness, perspective in that craziness. So let's pause here a second. Do you have something you can do to help clarify yourself? Your goal as a leader, something you would like to do in terms of purpose. So let's just pause here. I'm going to open up for Q&A. Let's just touch on purpose a little bit, the importance of purpose or questions around purpose as a leader. And these can be comments. Welcome, Danielkas from Key Largo, Florida. Good to see you. So who's got a question or comments? Put it in chat, jump on video, share. I'll pause. And I won't start until somebody says something. You guys are really going to challenge me here, huh? Come on. We got something. All right. Well, we got one. Goncalo, thank you. What is my ideal? What would it be? Perfect future self. Wow, that's a that's a strong image. Perfect future self. I look for maybe a little bit better future self, but look incrementally, adapt. But yeah, having an ideal is certainly a good one. Any other comments here on purpose? So again, what I'm trying to point out is we often take things to the extreme. Adaptation doesn't mean we have to adapt our vision. Yeah, we can, but in fact, it's that vision that creates the clarity of agility and movement. And this is true whether you're a product owner, this is true whether you're a scrum master, this is true whether you are a leader of an organization, some department, division, team. Creating more clarity enables agility. And I think that gets forgotten a lot. Clear values, good. Yep. That's another one in terms of shaping culture is the values that you are upholding? Do we have values of creativity, values of innovation, values of teamwork, things like that? Good. Okay. Well, let's go on. What I want to focus on here now is the second one, which is perspective. And what I love about the word perspective, when we look back at the definition of perspective, it says perspective is a particular attitude or a way of regarding something, a point of view. I love that word, attitude. Right? You think of attitude, you think of that teenager who has an attitude to their parents, right? That's an attitude. It's an attitude of disgust a lot of times for teenagers and their parents. But recognize then, if perspective has attitude, what does that mean? So let me share a story with you. One Saturday morning, I was deep in thought, writing for an article. So I'm doing my thing, and my partner comes over to me and says, "Pete, I've got to share something with you." And she was obviously recognized that she interrupted me and that I was annoyed by that. And she was going to share something with me because she was on the phone with her mom for a while. And in that moment, my attitude came across as, I don't want to be interrupted. And I recognized she left pretty quickly without sharing what she was going to share. And I realized within, microseconds, but certainly a few seconds, all right, that probably wasn't the right attitude at that moment to bring across. And so what ensued is a typical relationship challenge. All right, I made a mistake. Go try to correct that. Say, okay, I would like to try that again. What was interesting about this, it's not new. I know you've probably run into this hundreds of times with partners and kids and coworkers and things like that. But what's interesting is not necessarily the fact that it occurred, but it was the fact that of the correction, right? So when we think about life comes at us full speed, and 10% of that is the act of happening. 90% is how we react to it. Charles Swindoll's a religious leader in the U.S. that had this quote, and I love the quote because it really shows up in this moment. Okay, the minor thing is what she wanted to share with me, something important to her. The major thing is how I took that in that moment and responded. So the danger here is without the additional perspectives, our thinking and feelings are narrowed and misplaced. So in this case, my position took over and hers didn't. Adaptive leaders seek to explore other perspectives first. So in this case, what I found out is that her mother was very sick, dealing with cancer, and got some really bad news. And I wasn't there in that moment to be able to recognize that, thinking my work is more important in that moment. And so again, we're going to make mistakes. How do we respond in that moment? I was pretty proud that within minutes, I was able to turn that around and say, okay, let's try that again. Doesn't fix it, but it certainly puts that perspective into play where I'm not stuck for weeks, months, days, hours, whatever that might be. So let me share another one that's a little bit similar, but in a work environment. So we're sharing hiring a new person on our team, right? A kind of a C-level person in a small team. So it's a fairly significant position for us. And I send out information to my team and I say, hey, I'd like feedback on this leader that we're thinking about hiring. And we went through the process. We ended up, got some feedback. We ended up hiring her. She was great for the business, worked out great. 2 months later, I was getting feedback on my leadership from our team because we often do that. And one of our managing partners said, Pete, in that moment of you asking for feedback for the senior leader, your mind was already made up. Hold on a second. I'm seeing video issues. Oh, okay. Question, but let me keep going. Your mind, Pete, was already made up. And I was like, damn, he was right. Here I was asking for feedback on a leader, which I probably already decided we're going to hire. What I was asking for was perspective about how we were going to use her on the team. We could do some coaching. She could do some operational. She can be placed in lots of different ways. How are we gonna structure this so it works for everybody? But I wasn't clear with that. And so here I had a perspective, somebody else had a perspective, and boom, they clash, right? And this happens every day at work. I know this isn't new. What's different for an adaptive leader is how quickly can you change, learn, and adapt from perspective. So in this particular situation, it came 2 months later. Now, I could have been completely frustrated by that. Hey, why didn't you share this with me 2 months ago in the moment? I could be frustrated by that, but I could also celebrate the fact that, hey, thank you for sharing that with me. I've grown because you've shared that information. And next time we do this, I can be a little clearer on my expectations of what I'm looking for in feedback. And so we often think about perspective as it has to be real time. Adaptive leaders look at perspective as there's always a continuum, and perspective is always going to be sliced. We're always going to make mistakes. What is our recovery time? With my partner, it was in seconds and minutes. In this one, it was weeks, months, right? How do we shorten these timelines so that you get perspective as quickly as possible? So how do you get perspective, right? You've got to, first of all, take a step back. Patience. Second, you've got to let go. You've got to create openness, saying, wait a second, I've got to let go of my perspective for me to get other perspectives. Third, we ask some questions. Fourth, we take it in. We can't just ask the question, we got to absorb it. And then finally, we ask for that feedback. We're explicit about these things. So what we want to think about here is adaptive leaders, again, learn how to be adaptive, number one, through purpose, and number two, through perspective, that when I can start to see a landscape, I can start to now adapt in a much more meaningful way. So I'm going to pause here because I did notice a question she had going back to purpose. So I'm going to hold that question until we finish this. So perspective. Leaders have an effective agility in action due to enhanced agility and perspective. So adaptive leaders learn faster in order to act faster. So let's pause here and talk a little bit about perspective. So I want you to gather your questions on perspective. What perspective are you lacking? So when I think about myself, number one, my purpose. One of the things I'm working on this year is my purpose to be a more human leader. What does that mean? I want to be a leader who doesn't just focus on work, but focuses on the person. So that's something I'm working on. The perspective I often lack is a perspective of feeling versus facts. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I learned along the way is feelings are facts. I thought this was a really powerful statement for me, someone who's an engineer and talks about facts all the time. And my coach said, Pete, feelings are facts. And I said, what? That doesn't make sense to me. She said, what is a feeling? A feeling is a body sensation. Well, body sensation is a fact. It's happening to you. Are you aware of the body sensation? So what was really fascinating to me is like, okay, this is giving me some new perspective, even in myself. Makes me a better leader towards my purpose. So again, I'll ask you, what's your perspective you'd like to a little bit more about? So I'm going to pause here. So Danielle, let's go back to your question on purpose. 100% on board with your mindset and foundation of purpose. However, could we help lead our team towards the same foundation and awareness? I've been a business analyst for over 20 years. Understanding my stakeholders' perspective is the reason for my success. It's the only way to seek value. Yeah, I mean, you think of every leadership position. So product ownership. Purpose is where are we going as a product? Market, understanding, goals, visions, right? Obviously, that's important. Perspective, stakeholders. Everybody has a different perspective. And I find, in that product ownership world, I find product owner to be the most difficult position ever because you can't solve the problem, right? Your expectations of all your stakeholders will always outweigh the capacity of your teams. So again, your job is an optimization problem. How do I optimize the fewest amount of features and functionality to get the most value for my stakeholders, right? So having purpose perspective in that range is a really, really effective way to do that. So how could we get our leadership team towards the same foundation and awareness? That's why we teach leadership. I think it just needs, it's an educational perspective. So questions here, pause here, and feel free to jump on and share verbally too. I get tired of hearing myself talking. Thanks. I'm going to say this round. Yeah, Jorg, is the first step about perspective about your self-awareness. Absolutely. If you can get perspective on yourself, and that was again, okay, how am I feeling? How am I thinking? How am I showing up in this moment? What is my purpose? What's my intent in this moment? The more you can have self-awareness, the more you're going to, again, be able to start to understand, and then gaining perspective from others. Yes. So I love that comment. Thank you. Other comments here?
Well, Pete, can I?
Hey, look at that. Thank you.
Hello. It's just a comment. I think to become a better leader, it's very important to know how it's been in the other's shoes. So in all stakeholders, it's very important to know their perspective by thinking like them. Even in our team, because we all have different roles. So the perspectives of each person is different. So I think it's very important, and the feedback all the time. It's we all make mistakes every time. It's not the problem. It's not the mistake. It's how we pass them and learn about it, and can share the knowledge with the other people, I think.
Yeah, and no perspective was without bias. Go back to that, right? No perspective is without bias. And so recognizing the bias and then checking that. Somebody asked at the pre-session when we had the Q&A session, well, how do I get people to speak up? Well, people are only going to speak up if you respect them. And what you're getting at, Felipe, is that getting perspective of others is a respect. If I don't respect people, this won't happen. And this is, again, where power and presence come in, which we're going to talk about next. If I feel like my position's more powerful than yours, that's a lack of respect. And therefore, people aren't going to speak up.
Yes, but we have to be there and listen. Like you told your story, it's not when your wife told with you, came and speak with you. It's not just sit there and try to listen. It's listen effectively. Yeah. So if they know they are listened, we have lots of feedback. So it's going to be improved with the time, I think.
And that's the source of empathy. And that's not a strong suit of mine, by the way. And I could get her in here and she could share that with you, right? So it's we call this an agile leadership journey because it's something we're on forever. This is a lifestyle, not a state transition. Oh, I'm an agile leader, right? That doesn't exist. It's kind of like saying you're fit, you're healthy. Well, the only way you're fit and healthy is if you practice every day. You're eating right every day. You're exercising every day. I mean, so yeah, this is something that we talk about. It's a constant focus and attention, which we'll get to. What is the most effective way to collect their perspective? We are very biased. That is true, and this is why I'll just go back a couple of slides here to this one. So, in order to gain other perspectives, so if you think about this. If I share what I think, that's to assert, that comes from me. That means I'm at the center. If you're gaining perspective, that means you have to take you out of the center and put others into the center. And this is what we call an accommodative power style. That means you have to step aside. That's hard, right? Everybody has an ego. Everybody has importance. So the only way to gain perspective is to let go of yours. And this is why, this is why we don't teach agile. We teach leadership. We teach self-awareness. We're teaching leaders to understand that just by nature of who you are, you're blocking people. And I'll get into that here in just a second. So these are the 5 things that I would recommend to create a little bit more balanced power style. If you're coming at this with more power, if you are a leader who has more power, more status than others in the organization, this is what you can do to help create a better balance. Now, this will work for everybody, especially for those with more power. So, all right, good question, Pedro. Thank you. All right, we're going to go into presence and power. Now, the comment here is every one of us has a presence and power, right? So what is that? That is the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others. So think about, and I use these 2 words together because it's really hard to separate them, that my presence is represented by my power, and my power is demonstrated through my presence. And I'll get into that here a little bit. So I use these 2 words together because I don't think one illustrates it well enough without the other. So they're a bit symbiotic in respect to each other. So back to my stories. I don't have a choice, but I am a Caucasian male, quite tall. You don't know that because I'm coming through Zoom. But, I'm the typical white male, right? And in terms of a US kind of person, that itself has a presence and power. Now, some of that comes from me, but some of that is what's given to me. Somebody says, "Oh, you're taller. That means you are, you're stronger. You're going to be a leader, right? Or you're male, therefore you have more power, right?" So sometimes power is taken, sometimes power is given, depending on some of these relationships, and power isn't equal in all cultures. So I'm not suggesting that white male 6'4" has all of this grandiose power. In some cultures, it may not. But in many instances, at least in the United States and in Europe, this does have some power dynamics to it, especially as relationship with other cultures. Now, I also have positional power. I'm a husband of 30 years. That's a positional power. I'm an owner of an organization and a founder of organizations of what I work with. I've got 2 different organizations that I work with, and I'll share about one of them. And then I've got experiential power, right? I've been in this business for a long time. I'm, 50 something years old. I've been leading and driving, and teaching, leadership for over 10 years. And so there's a history here, right, that I'm bringing as power. But everybody brings power. They just bring different types of power and presence to a relationship. So they're always displayed, whether you want them to or not, and who you are, how you're showing up. So go back to a scenario here. So in our organization, Agile Leadership Journey itself, I am the owner. I am the founder. I've got a bunch of default power. But we have a community of people who I consider my peers, right? These are other trainers and coaches. Well, I'm a trainer and coach. So when I get together with them, I think, hey, I'm a peer to you. We're equal. But the problem is we're not. And so we were doing a book club. And talk about a very lightweight meeting, right? We all read a book and we come and we talk about it. And one of our guides facilitates the discussion. Great. We share that's just a rotating role. It's not a formal authority. It's just, hey, take the lead, facilitate this conversation. Let's have some fun. Let's learn something. So a very informal meeting, very informal setting. I'm there as a participant. I'm not a leader in this particular meeting. In fact, I'm just there to contribute. I read the book. I enjoyed it. And at the beginning of this meeting, at the very, in the first 5 minutes, we're all connecting to Zoom. We're sharing. And there was some jokes around the leader who came, this particular facilitator who came, one of our guides, and she made a joke about using slides. like I'm using right now, I'm using slides. And she said, I feel like maybe I'm over controlling by using slides in this. And we happen to be talking about control and leadership. And so it was kind of funny. It was like a ironic kind of thing. And so a couple of us were just joking about, the control and slides and things like that. I probably put a joke out there and we're just having some fun. So we ran the meeting. Everything was great. I loved it. There was a good session. Everybody talked and things. I got an email after the meeting from the facilitator that said, Pete, I was completely put off by your comment and it threw me off for the entire meeting. And I got this email like maybe 10, 15 minutes after the meeting. And I'm like, oh. The facilitator was female. She's French in nationality, very well respected and all these things. But whatever it was, she gave me power as an owner, as the founder, as someone with experience in a positional sense, that where I thought I'm coming across as an equal, she's not seeing it that way. And so therefore my joke didn't land effectively, completely threw her sideways. Well, she didn't admit it in the meeting and I thought she did a great job. Obviously she was hurt. Now, this ensued with an email dialogue and we eventually talked. And so within minutes, we're clarifying that, number one, the perspective, but number two, the presence and power. And whether or not I got that feedback 5 minutes later, could have been real time. She could have said, hey, Pete, that hurt me. Maybe I never got that feedback. What I was proud of was the fact that she was able to email me 5 minutes later and say, Pete, that hurt. Because that proved that at least she had safety to say that directly to me. Now, I wish she would have said it in the meeting because maybe we could have cleared it up in real time. But at the same point, what I'm representing here is presence and power are always demonstrated by leaders. And by managing presence and power, we're going to be a much more effective leader. So what do adaptive leaders do better than most? They balance what they take in and what they put out. What does that mean? So let's go back to breathing. So take a pause. Take a breath. So do you notice in your breath the balance? Right? You can't just breathe in. And you can't just breathe out. You have to do both. That's what's called a polarity. One doesn't exist without the other. And this is also true with power. Right? Now, the problem with power is we can continue to take in, or we can continue to put out. And the problem is it becomes quite dysfunctional, just as if your life would become quite dysfunctional. If all I did was breathe in, you wouldn't survive. All you did is breathe out. The same is true with power, though. We often incorrectly state balance is a state. It's a place to be, when in fact balance is a continuous action. Balance means you're never truly in balance. You're always correcting balance. And this is true with any polarity, strategic and tactical. Should I delegate or should I take over? And should I connect with you or should I let you have it? Should I, empower or make decisions? Right? There's no right in these. What we can do at best as leaders is to be aware, again, self-awareness, and adapt. Meaning, I'm aware of my power and I'm balancing my power. So I want you to observe for a second, or just think about your one-on-one discussions with other people. How much do you take in? How much do you put out? Now, taking in means probably things like asking questions, gaining perspective, being patient, stepping back. Putting out means sharing ideas. In fact, I see we've got a few coaches here. One of the things I find in a lot of coaches ask a lot of questions. They often don't share very much. They're taught, hey, that's not the coach's position to share. That's a lot of taking in, very little putting out. And in fact, that's a dysfunctional relationship. That seems odd, you say. In fact, I find the coaches that I find to be the most effective challenge me. Push back on me. Say, Pete, you're saying this, but your body language is saying something else. That's putting out. That's a coach sharing their perspective. And coaching relationships are often unbalanced. And we know the coaching relationship of telling people is too problematic, but there's a coaching relationship problem on the other side too, just being too curious, not sharing can be just as problematic. But the coaching is just one type of one-on-one discussion. What about the employee and leader discussion? What about the peer discussion? How do you balance what you put in and what you take out? Now, the other side of this is how quickly are you swapping these? Because here's the other problem I see with a lot of one-on-one conversations and coaching conversations. I ask question, 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 I ask question. Oh, now I'm going to share. That's not adaptive. That's like a waterfall in a conversation, right? So adaptive leaders are actually using cycles. Oh, a couple questions, sharing, a couple questions. It's a dialogue. How are you, in fact, dealing with your dialogue in terms of presence and power? So all leaders have power style. More effective leaders are balancing this all the time in all their engagements. And we call this on the yellow side here, what you take in, we call this the accommodative power style. All right, and we've talked quite a bit about that. But there's also what you put out is the assertive power style. Oops, sorry about that. And again, if we want to go back, there was a pre-question before we got into the session about servant leadership. Well, when I ask most leaders, what is servant leadership? They're going to say, well, servant leadership is on the left. And that's the side that says, as leader, my job is to serve, right? That puts me on the side and you in front. That's what most people associate servant leadership to. But if you go back to the root source of Greenleaf says there's two sides to servant leadership. My role as leader is to serve, yes, the yellow, but my job as servant is to lead. That's the blue. That's what most people miss on servant leadership. Servant leadership is actually a quite balanced leadership style. But most people, again, forget that and just focus on the servant side of leadership. So, one more story, and we'll take a pause here. So I was being hired as a leader. And this was a VP of engineering position. So it was a fairly senior position. And I was being interviewed by the staff. So the people I would be leading are interviewing me. And within 5 minutes, 10 minutes of the interview, I recognized that there was a power imbalance in the room. One of the leaders was overtaking, kind of taking on the lead role in the negotiation, the questioning of me as the VP of engineering. And so I was aware of it in the moment, and I had a choice. I could just let it go. I'm not in a position of leadership here. It's not my role to decide how they're going to ask me questions. Maybe they agreed upon this at the beginning. One person's going to ask the questions. The others are just going to listen. Could be. I don't know. I decided in the moment to challenge. So I was, okay, I've heard a few questions. I'd actually like to hear some questions from the rest of the team here. And so I pushed back on one and I drew others out in the meeting. And I found the dialogue to be great and I ended up getting hired into that organization, small organization. And I found out later that this was a power imbalance in the relationship of this team. And one of the reasons they were looking for a VP of engineering is this senior architect was kind of micromanaging everybody. And it required some stronger leadership to come in and create a better balance. And one of the reasons they hired me is I was able to do that in real time in the interview. Now, I call this the Robin Hood of power. We shared that a little bit at the beginning in the Q&A part, if you missed that. The Robin Hood of power comes from a folklore in England about Robin Hood, who would steal money from the rich and give money to the poor, a socialist kind of concept. Well, I look at adaptive leaders as doing the same thing in organizations. Steal from the rich, power, and give to the poor, power. So who has power in an organization? Typically those higher up the chain, typically those in positional power, authority power, decision-making power. and who doesn't is the other employees. So what a real effective adaptive leader will do is start to figure out how we can balance those power dynamics, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. In this particular meeting, I did it in real time. So I'll ask you the question: how are you balancing your power in meetings, in teams, in your organizations? So you're not only balancing your own power, you're balancing others. So think about some of your meetings. How effective do each of them take in? How effective do each of them put out? How effective is the balance in the room? Because every team meeting is going to be unbalanced in some way. And what are you doing to better that balance? This could be your peer group and your manager. This could be your scrum team and you're a scrum master or just a team member. This could be your team of scrum masters. Whatever that is, you do not have to be in charge to make a difference, to balance the power in the room. You can draw somebody out who's quiet. You can push back on somebody who's loud. So before we take a pause break here, story about Josh and his new boss. There is a great story, and we have a whole podcast dedicated to leadership stories. It's called Relearning Leadership. Encourage you to explore this a little bit. I'll put a link to this in the chat here. But Josh told a beautiful story about getting a new boss who was quite assertive. And he found himself in this balance between, okay, either I placate, that means I just give in, or I defend. I defend my position. And he was stuck between these two, and he was having challenge to solve this power imbalance with his boss. So this particular podcast episode was focusing on his how he solved this problem. I won't spoil the ahas after it. Most of our leadership stories not only talk to Josh as a leader, but we also then talk, in this case, to Rachel Weston Rao, who is another leadership coach who helped us kind of diagnose Josh's challenge and what we can learn from it. So encourage you to listen to some of those stories if you would like. So let's pause here. What power biases are you displaying? And that balancing might help your agility. So open up the phone lines, comment, write some questions. Anybody want to share a story of a power imbalance? Or a power balancing? Come on, you guys are giving me too much power. I want to give it back to the people. Comments, questions? So what we talk about is these techniques, all right, your purpose, perspective, presence, and power. These can be done at any place in the organization. These can be done with anybody, right? Becoming a more adaptive leader. You can influence, just like we talked about in the pre with Travis. You can influence culture, shape culture by taking these techniques and applying them. Now, are you going to change others this way? Only if you start to demonstrate a little bit more power and start to balance power and start to recognize your active side, right? My role as servant is to lead. If you have a sense of leadership and purpose, then you can start to shape culture in others and around others. All right. Any comments, questions before we close on the last one here? Okay, last one, practice. So practice is pretty easy to understand, right? So it's an application or repeated exercise. So think about adaptiveness not like a state, right? Think about like health and fitness, right? This is a lifestyle, right? You are not healthy unless you're practicing every day. You're not fit unless you're practicing every day. This isn't something you can let go of. It's not a state transition. This is true with an adaptive organization, as is true with an adaptive leader. Unless you have a lifestyle of adaptiveness, unless you have a lifestyle of these behaviors, it doesn't happen. And this is the difference between teaching like leadership and okay, I have an awareness. I know what it means to be a better agile leader. That's meaningless. It's great. It's great insight, but it doesn't change anything. You have to actually be active in this to be effective. So here it was a great question. Violinist Nathan Milstein, asked his teacher. He said, hey, it seems like everybody else around us is, practicing so much. So how much should I be practicing? And his teacher actually said a surprising answer. He said it actually doesn't really matter. That if you practice with your fingers, no amount was enough. But if you practice with your head, 2 hours was plenty. So what's he getting at here? He's getting at intentful practice, right? He's getting at purposeful practice. So creating a purpose around your practice is what improves performance. That's a lot of P's, sorry. Dedicated practice. I am attempting, let's say you're just talking about, okay, I want to improve soccer or football. All right, I'm gonna work on my ball balance, right? So I can keep the ball and foot. All right, I'm working on piano. I'm gonna work on smooth transitions. I'm working on my leadership. I'm gonna work on trying to balance the power in my team meetings. You need a focal point. You need a lens at which you're going to practice, or practice doesn't really mean anything. It's just a routine. It's going to get into the subconscious, not very useful. So Aristotle says we are what we do repeatedly. So how do you build a habit, right? So this is another play on words. So we talk about the 5 fixations of adaptive leaders. Well, I have to be fixated on some things to adapt in others. The same is true with habits. We have to develop a habit, but the habit has to be a habit of change. So we call this a learning cycle. So what is a learning cycle? Well, a learning cycle says, I'm going to focus on something. I need to build the resolution to do it. That's the determination to do this focus. Then I'm going to act, and then I'm going to reflect on that act. And, that's going to give me an ability to learn, right? So I create the focus and go through the cycle. Well, of course, that reflection is going to refocus us, and we go through the cycle again. Right. So this is what we call a learning cycle. Now, what's interesting is certainly we could get unexpected events, which we have to react to, and that's going to, impact this curve as well. So in fact, what we call this is a relearning cycle. This is why we have relearning leadership. Relearning cycle says this thing is never done. So my ability to adapt is actually cyclical. How do I go through this process, create focus, resolution, action, and reflection, and do this continuously? Now, one of the best ways we find to do this is to use something called a catalyst conversation. So this is a technique we teach that helps create the purpose. Okay, what are we trying to solve here? Explore the perspective. How do we actually get the different perspectives on the table? Clarify our understanding. That means, okay, making sure that we're not just hearing what we're hearing, but actually what they said, and then balancing the power, right? So that means I don't just sit back, but I'm also sharing and then giving back power to others, right? And the empower action. So the catalyst conversation is simply a technique that can be done in one-on-one conversations, team meetings, giving, receiving feedback, resolving conflict, dealing with stakeholders, work, home, etc. So it's one simple tool that you can do that kind of allows you to practice all of these things together. So, and this works over Zoom. So, summary. These are what I call the 5 fixations of what makes a more adaptive leader. And if you can practice these every day, you will be a much more effective adaptive leader, and you will start to shape the culture around you, what you have control over, those meetings, interactions. We call this the microculture in the organization. Again, we have more on the relearning leadership, and our agile leadership journey has awareness sessions and competency building programs if you're interested a little bit more on those. So I'm going to pause, open up for questions. 5 minutes to go. Let's see. Yao says, nowadays, the power of knowledge from technical skills or position overcomes this balance. What's the first step to change this balance? So what you're talking about, Yao, is what we would call an expert orientation. So knowledge is value. That's great. Expertise is good to have in an organization. The problem is when expertise turns into what we call the expert mindset. Now, what's the difference? Expertise is knowledge of something. The expert mindset is the sharing of that knowledge that you're right, which means they're wrong, or your answer is better. So what we talk about is separating expertise, knowledge, from an expert mindset, being right or wrong. And if you can have the expertise with a more adaptive, open mindset that maybe my perspective is biased, maybe my knowledge is inappropriate for the situation, maybe my knowledge has gotten old and there's new information, maybe my knowledge is limited, right? So it's have the expertise, but then change the mindset. So that's what we try to teach leaders. Expertise is great, but the expert mindset is difficult. Great question. Anybody else like to jump in? Question? Conversation? Story to share? Let's see. I'm seeing a difficult transition for people who are used to command and control. This is from Pedro. Balance power is not even for a moment like a meeting. Lots of patience is required. Yeah. Well, and this is where there's a difference between being aware and changing behavior. Most leaders in their mind are one step ahead of their action. So in my mind, I'm engaging, but in my action, I'm pushing or I'm biasing or I'm cutting off. And so this is very, very typical. And so again, creating awareness for leaders that the difference between what you think and what others see is really, there's a gap there. Just as an example of this, most leaders, so 80% of leaders believe they're supportive of employees. But when you ask employees, 25% of those employees agree. So what that says is there's a huge gap between what a leader thinks they're doing and how other people see what they're doing. Again, it's all about that self-awareness. Other questions? Any last comments here? If you would like to follow our Agile Leadership Journey, we are on LinkedIn. Feel free to do so. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and appreciate you participating. So thank you.